September 3rd, 2019. Harlan County, Nebraska. And every single grain elevator within 35 miles had trucks backed up past the county road by 5:30 in the morning. Every farmer in that county and the two adjacent ones was doing the exact same thing. They were moving fast because the signal had come from everywhere at once. From the co-op manager, from the Agri-Week radio segment, from the commodity advisors whose newsletters hit every farmhouse mailbox in the region the Friday before. Soybean prices had plateaued. The summer had been brutal on yields across the Midwest, and the market had responded exactly the way markets respond to scarcity. It ran up, hard. 6 beans had become $6.91 beans and $6.91 beans. Every advisor agreed we're living on borrowed time. Sell now, they said. Don't wait for the top. The top is already behind you. So they did. All of them. Neighbors who hadn't shared a fence line conversation since a property dispute in 2014. Brothers who split the family operation and hadn't spoken at Thanksgiving in 3 years. Men who disagreed on rotation schedules, on chemical programs, on which brand of planter was worth a damn. They all agreed on this one thing. You sell when the price is fair and the bins are full. Dale Pruitt had his second load at the scale before 7 a.m. Cody Wachter was already on his third run by 8, calling his wife from the cab to say they'd have the harvest check deposited before the weekend. Down the road, the Kettner boys, all 3 of them, farming their late father's ground together, had emptied every bin on the property the afternoon before and were already arguing about what to do with the margin. A new header? A used grain leg? Maybe finally fix the drainage tile on the east quarter. The elevator in Dawson Flats had to call in 2 extra staff just to manage the scale tickets. And then there was Raul M. Morriston, 61 years old. Red flannel shirt, worn to the texture of old rope, a cowboy hat that had seen more Nebraska weather than most men twice his age. He was standing out in the harvested field when Dale and Cody pulled up that morning, not loading, not moving, not on the phone. Just bent forward at the waist the way he always did, one hand braced on his knee, the other reaching into the loose grain at his feet. He lifted a fistful slowly, held it up and let it fall, kernel by kernel, back to the ground, like he was reading something the rest of them couldn't see. Dale climbed out of his truck and stood there a moment watching him. "Raul," he finally said, "what are you doing?" Raul watched the last few kernels drop. "Waiting," he said. The check cleared on a Wednesday. Raul saw the deposit confirmation on his phone at 6:14 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in the same clothes he'd worn to check the bins. He looked at the number for a moment, the way you look at something you've been waiting to see for long enough that seeing it feels almost unfamiliar. Then he set the phone down and called First Ag Bank in Chadron and asked for Gerald Finch. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, make sure you hit subscribe before this story is done, because this is exactly the kind of thing we do here. Real decisions, real stakes, real people who trusted something nobody else could see yet. The fall of 2019 didn't look like a historic moment from the outside. No natural disaster, no front-page crisis, just a harvest season in Harlan County, Nebraska, that moved the way harvest seasons move. Heavy with work and noise and the low, steady pressure of decisions that can't be unmade once you make them. Raul M. Morriston had been living inside that pressure for most of his adult life. Not because farming was uniquely cruel to him, but because it was the only life he'd ever wanted. And the only life worth wanting costs something. It had cost his father 11 years to clear the original debt on the first 200 acres he'd broken in 1959. It had cost Raul most of his 30s to expand the operation to its current size. 1,100 acres of Nebraska ground that had been in the family long enough that the land and the name had become difficult to separate in the minds of people who'd known both. He had a $218,000 equipment note at First Ag Bank in Chadron, financed in 2016 when the old combine finally cost more to repair than to replace, and the price outlook had looked, briefly, like it was turning in a farmer's direction. He had an operating loan with a satisfaction date of November 15th. He had iron in the shed, grain in the bins, and a bank officer named Gerald Finch, who had already left one carefully worded voicemail and was, Raul understood, preparing to leave another. He had 1,100 acres his father's hands had first turned and his own hands had spent 40 years learning. And he had a piece of paper on the refrigerator. It had been there for 8 years, held flat by a magnet from an insurance company that no longer existed, folded once along a soft crease that had gone almost white from years of staying in the same position. Elena had written a number on it, her handwriting, blue ink, slightly faded now, the winter before she got sick. She'd sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and worked through the full picture of what they had and what they owed and what it would take to come out clean on the other side of it all. She'd written the final number on a separate piece of paper, folded it, and stuck it to the refrigerator without making a ceremony of it. "So we don't forget what we're working toward," she'd said. 14 months later, she was gone. Raul had walked past that paper every morning since. He didn't unfold it anymore. He knew the number. He just wasn't there yet. And until he was, the paper stayed exactly where she'd put it, on the refrigerator, in her handwriting, holding the finish line in place. That was what the land cost. Not just money. Not just years. Everything. Dale Pruitt had been farming in Harlan County for 31 years. He wasn't a reckless man, wasn't a greedy one. He'd built his operation the same way most men out here built theirs. Carefully, incrementally, with a deep and specific memory for every he'd tried to outsmart the market and paid for it. He remembered 2008. He remembered 2012. He'd held grain both of those years, waiting for a number that kept not arriving, and he'd sold late and low both times, while his input costs kept running. That education had cost him enough that he didn't need to repeat it. So when the co-op called and the newsletter said, and the radio confirmed what he already felt in his gut, that $6.91 was as good as this harvest was going to get, Dale loaded his trucks and drove to the elevator without a second thought. Not out of fear. Out of experience. Cody Wachter was 10 years younger and farmed 800 acres 2 miles east of Raul's property line. He and Dale weren't close friends exactly, but they were the kind of neighbors that farm country produces. Men who'd pull over for each other on the side of a gravel road without being asked. Who showed up when equipment broke down during planting. They'd arrived at the elevator within 20 minutes of each other that morning, fallen into the same line, and by 9:30 they were standing together in the gravel lot with empty trailers and signed scale tickets, and the particular quiet that follows a decision you've fully committed to. The harvest check would hit Dale's account by Thursday. He'd already called his wife. Cody leaned against his truck and watched the line of incoming rigs move slowly toward the scale. He pulled the brim of his cap down against the morning glare. The lot was full. Every farmer in the county, it seemed, was somewhere in that line. Almost every farmer. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did Dale. Then Cody turned and looked out toward the road, in the general direction of Morriston ground, the way you look toward something you're not quite willing to name out loud. "You think Raul's going to be okay?" he said. Dale was quiet for a long moment. He didn't answer. Raul had not made his decision that morning in the field. He'd made it 6 weeks earlier at the kitchen table, at 11 o'clock at night, with a cup of coffee going cold beside a printout he'd pulled from a USDA export demand summary that most farmers in Harlan County had never heard of and wouldn't have subscribed to if they had. He wasn't smarter than his neighbors. He'd never believed that about himself. But he read differently than they did. Where most men in the county tracked local yield reports and co-op bulletins and the commodity segment on the regional ag radio station, Raul had spent 20 years developing a habit of going one layer deeper. He read the underlying data. He followed the foreign production numbers. He'd learned through enough hard seasons that the price you saw on the board at the elevator was always a lagging indicator. A reflection of something that had already happened somewhere else, weeks or months before. What was happening somewhere else right now was in Brazil's Mato Grosso state, the single largest soybean-producing region on Earth. And it was not good. The rainfall deficit had started quietly in late July. The kind of early-season dry pattern that didn't make international headlines, but showed up clearly in the satellite soil moisture indices that Raul had bookmarked on his desktop. By mid-August, it had deepened. By the first week of September, the Brazilian Ag Ministry's own crop condition reports were starting to use language that, if you read them carefully and knew what you were looking at, meant one thing: their projected export volume for the coming quarter was going to fall short, possibly well short. At the same time, a separate USDA report Raul had been tracking showed export inspection numbers running 14% above the prior year's pace. Demand was accelerating. Supply was quietly tightening. The market hadn't priced it yet, not fully, because most of the people setting the local price were looking at the same short-term signals and calling it a peak. Raul thought they were looking at the wrong window. He didn't discuss this with Dale or Cody, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he'd tried explaining futures curve logic to neighboring farmers before, and the conversation had always ended the same way, politely, with a subject change. It wasn't arrogance that kept him quiet. It was efficiency. Gerald Finch, his loan officer at First Ag Bank in Chadron, didn't know any of this. What Gerald knew was that Raul Morriston's bins were full, and his equipment note was due November 15th. And that as of the first week of September, no grain had moved. Gerald was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one. He'd left a voicemail on a Tuesday afternoon, professional, measured, the kind of message that was friendly on the surface and carried weight underneath. Raul had listened to it twice. Then he'd gone back to his printouts. He woke at 1:47 a.m. and knew immediately he wasn't going back to sleep. It happened more now than it used to. His body would carry him through the work of the day without complaint, and then deposit him in the dark at some unreasonable hour with his mind already running, already itemizing, already doing the arithmetic on things that didn't resolve cleanly into numbers. He lay still for a few minutes out of habit, staring at the ceiling, and then gave it up and went to the kitchen. He made coffee he didn't need and pulled the folder out from under the stack of seed invoices on the counter. The same folder he'd been working from for 6 weeks, printouts and export tables, and the Brazilian crop condition reports he'd downloaded and annotated in the margins with a ballpoint pen. He spread them on the table and read through them again. 4th time. Maybe 5th. He'd stopped counting. The data said what it had always said. The Mato Grosso deficit was real. The export pace was real. The supply and demand math worked from 3 separate sources, pointed in the same direction it had always pointed. He closed the folder. Data was not a promise. He understood that. A man could read every report correctly and still be early, and early in a grain market with a banknote due in 3 weeks was its own particular kind of wrong. The market could stay irrational longer than he could stay solvent. He'd heard that said, had even said it himself once to a younger farmer who'd been holding too long for the wrong reasons. He sat with the cold coffee and looked across the table at the counter, where Elena's photograph had lived since the year she died. It was a small frame, nothing formal, a snapshot from a July afternoon, her standing at the edge of the east field, with her hand shading her eyes, squinting into the sun, almost smiling. He'd taken it without her knowing. He didn't talk to it often. He wasn't that kind of man, or hadn't thought he was. But it was 2 a.m. and the letter from Gerald was on the table and the bins were full and the price was 6.74 cents. And he needed, not reassurance exactly, but something closer to permission. "I think I'm right," he said quietly. The kitchen was silent. He sat there a while longer. Then he put the folder away and went back to bed. The letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a seed catalog and a utility bill in the aluminum mailbox at the end of the drive. It was printed on First Ag Bank letterhead, the kind of stationery that communicated institutional permanence. Thick paper, clean margins, the bank's logo embossed in navy at the top. Gerald Finch's name was printed below his signature in the same measured font. The whole thing had the appearance of routine correspondence. That was, Raul understood, precisely the point. He brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and read it standing up, still in his jacket. Gerald opened with the harvest season, acknowledged it had been a productive one across the region, expressed genuine hope that Raul's yields had come in well. One paragraph of that. Warm, collegial. The tone of a man who wanted you to know he was on your side before he told you something you weren't going to like. The second paragraph was where the letter became what it actually was. The bank had noted, Gerald wrote, that the Morriston operation's grain storage remained at capacity as of their most recent records. He understood, of course, that every producer managed their marketing timeline differently, and he had the utmost respect for Raul's experience and judgment. However, and there it was, that word doing its quiet load-bearing work. Given the current terms of the operating note and the November 15th satisfaction date, the bank wanted to ensure they were aligned on the path forward. If market conditions or other factors were creating challenges in meeting that timeline, Gerald encouraged Raul to reach out at his earliest convenience so they could discuss options. Options. That word did its own kind of work. What Gerald did not say, because men like Gerald never said it directly, was that if the note wasn't satisfied on time, the bank would be looking at the collateral. At the equipment. At the terms of the next operating loan. At all the leverage a lender accumulates over 30 years of doing business with the same family. He didn't need to say it. Raul had been reading between lines his entire adult life. He set the letter down on the kitchen table and stood there a moment. Then he picked it up, walked to the refrigerator, and held it flat against the door beside the folded piece of notebook paper with Elena's number on it. He looked at both of them. The bank's careful language on one side, her handwriting on the other. The thing that was threatening to take the farm, the thing that explained why he couldn't let it. He stood there for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind moved through the harvested fields with nothing left to catch on. The bin sat full in the dark, and the number on the board in Dawson Flats was still $6.74, and November 15th was 22 days away. Raul put the letter on the table and went to bed. The board at the Dawson Flats elevator read $6.74 on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October. It had slipped quietly, the way bad news usually does. Not in a single dramatic drop, but in a slow bleed that made it easy to dismiss until it wasn't. 17 cents. Not a collapse, not a crisis. Just the market doing what the market does when the initial pressure eases and the traders start rotating out and the seasonal pattern reasserts itself, like gravity. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked exactly like what the co-op had been warning about for weeks. The peak was in. The slide had started. Raul saw the number on his phone that morning and said nothing. He poured his coffee, folded the phone face down on the table, and went out to check the bins the same way he did every morning, walking the perimeter, checking the aeration fans, looking for any sign of heat or moisture that would tell him the grain was turning. It wasn't. The beans were holding clean and dry, the same as they'd been the day before. He latched the bin door and walked back to the machine shed. Dale's truck came up the gravel drive that evening just before dark. He didn't call ahead. He pulled in slow, the way a man does when he's not entirely sure of his welcome, and climbed out with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said he was just passing by. Said he'd been meaning to stop in for a while. He stood on the porch steps and didn't come inside, and Raul stood in the doorway and didn't invite him. And for a few minutes, they talked about the weather and the condition of the roads after the last rain and a bearing that had gone out on Dale's grain cart. Neither of them said the number. They didn't need to. Dale said he hoped things were going all right. Raul said they were fine. Dale nodded, looked out at the bins sitting full and dark against the tree line, and nodded again like he was confirming something he'd already decided on the drive over. "Well," he said, "you know where I'm at." He backed his truck out and headed down the road. Raul stood on the porch in the early dark and watched the tail lights disappear. The night was cold and still, and the bins hadn't moved, and somewhere out in Mato Grosso, the ground was still dry. He went back inside. The check cleared on a Wednesday. Raul saw the deposit confirmation on his phone at 6:14 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in the same clothes he'd worn to check the bins. He looked at the number for a moment, the way you look at something you've been waiting to see for long enough that seeing it feels almost unfamiliar. Then he set the phone down and called First Ag Bank in Chadron and asked for Gerald Finch. Gerald picked up on the second ring. His voice had a different quality than it had carried in the voicemail from October or in the careful architecture of his letter. Warmer. Lighter. The professional cordiality was still there, but underneath it was something closer to genuine relief. And underneath that, if Raul was reading it right, the faint trace of a man who understood he had underestimated something and was too measured to say so directly. He confirmed the payoff figure. Confirmed the lien release would be processed within 5 business days. Said it had been a pleasure doing business with the Morriston operation, and that he looked forward to continuing that relationship going forward. Raul thanked him, told him he appreciated the call, and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The room was quiet, the way it was always quiet, the particular silence of a house that had held one person for 7 years, that had absorbed that solitude into its walls and stopped apologizing for it. The refrigerator hummed against the east wall. He walked to it. The piece of notebook paper was where it had always been, held flat by the insurance company magnet, creased soft along the fold from years of existing in the same spot without being moved. He took it down carefully and unfolded it on the counter. Elena's handwriting. Blue ink, slightly faded. The number she'd worked out at this same table on a winter evening 8 years ago. Won $100,000, the full payoff value of the farm, the figure that represented the finish line she'd wanted them to have in front of them always, so they'd know what they were working toward. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't cross it out. He didn't need to. The accounting had done that on its own, in the only way that actually counted, not in ink, but in fact. The farm was clear. The number was met. The promise she'd hung on the refrigerator was kept. He folded the paper along its original crease and put it in his shirt pocket. Left side, closest to his chest. If any part of this story stayed with you, the waiting, the doubt, the quiet work of a man who trusted what he'd read when no one else did, take a second to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Stories like Raul's deserve to be heard, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. He went outside. The equipment wouldn't winterize itself. He had a farm to run. The board hit $8.47 on Thursday morning, and Raul decided that was his number. Not because it was the peak. He had no way of knowing where the peak was, and chasing it was how men who'd been right ended up wrong. $8.47 was the number that cleared the equipment loan, covered the operating note, put the next 2 planting seasons on solid ground, and got him within range of Elena's number on the refrigerator. That was enough. That had always been enough. He called the elevator at 7 a.m., told them he'd be moving grain starting that afternoon, and hung up before they could ask him how much. He worked alone. The first truck was loaded and on the road by 2 o'clock Thursday. Raul behind the wheel the way he'd been behind the wheel of that same truck for 11 years. The county road ran flat and straight between harvested fields, and in the cab there was no music, no radio, just the sound of the diesel and the weight of the load settling into the gravel, and the particular silence of a man who has been waiting a long time to do a specific thing and is now doing it. He watched the road. He drove. He made 3 runs Thursday, 4 on Friday, starting before sunrise and finishing past dark with a flashlight and a trouble light strung from the bin ladder. His phone rang in his shirt pocket throughout. Dale on Thursday afternoon, Cody twice on Friday morning, a farmer named Steckelberg from the next township over whom Raul barely knew, and once on Friday evening, a number he didn't recognize that he suspected was a journalist from the county ag paper who'd heard something secondhand and wanted a comment. He let every one of them go to voicemail. It wasn't arrogance. A man who'd spent 6 weeks quietly certain while everyone around him expressed doubt didn't need to be vindicated out loud. There was nothing to announce. There was grain to move and a road to drive and a scale ticket to collect at the end of each run, and the work deserved his full attention until it was finished. That was all. Saturday and Sunday he pushed harder, the days blurring into a rhythm of auger and truck and scale and return. The miles of gravel road so familiar by the 4th day that he drove the last few runs in full dark without thinking about the route at all. The fields on either side sat empty and frost-edged and quiet. The elevator crew had stopped making small talk by Saturday afternoon. They just ran his tickets and let him load out. Sunday evening, just past 7, the last truck rolled across the scale at Dawson Flats. The scale operator printed the ticket without ceremony. Raul folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and drove home in the dark. 47,000 bushels. 4 days. Done. It came on a Tuesday. Raul was up before 5, the same as always, and had the radio on low while he made coffee when the Agri-Week morning segment led with something it had never led with in his memory. A breaking commodity alert. A consortium of Chinese state-affiliated importers had announced an accelerated purchase agreement for American soybeans, the single largest forward buy commitment in 3 years. The announcement had dropped overnight, while the futures markets were still open in Asia. By the time the Chicago Board of Trade opened at 8:30, the move was already in motion. He turned the radio up. Soybean futures were indicated up 6.4% at the open. The anchor was reading it carefully, the way broadcasters read numbers they want to make sure they're getting right. Raul poured his coffee, put the cup in the sink untouched, and drove to Dawson Flats. He wasn't there to sell. Not yet. The trucks weren't loaded, and you didn't move 47,000 bushels on sentiment alone. He drove to the elevator the way a man drives to confirm something he has quietly believed for a long time but has never been allowed to say out loud. He parked in the gravel lot and stood outside his truck and looked at the board. The number was climbing in real time. $7.38. Then, $7.61. A small group of farmers had gathered near the scale house, some of them on their phones, some of them just standing and watching the board with the particular stillness of men doing math they didn't expect to be doing today. Nobody talked to Raul. He didn't invite it. By the time he drove home at mid-morning, the move had extended to 11% on the session. The board read $7.82, and the trading day wasn't over. The Brazil drought, which had been a footnote in the regional ag press for weeks, was suddenly the lead story on every commodity wire in the country. The supply picture Raul had been reading in isolation for 6 weeks was now being read by everyone, all at once, 6 weeks too late. His phone rang twice on the drive home. Dale, then Cody. He let them both go. He pulled into the farm, changed his clothes, and went to the machine shed to start checking the augers. There was work to do, and he intended to do it.